Hey, speaking of play calls, guys, have you heard? The Alabama Crimson Tide back in the market on the offensive side of the ball, where a coordinator and, as we're learning, an offensive line coach, quarterbacks comes into this too. Tim, as we saw over the weekend, and understandably to an extent, some anxiety on the roundtable there with us at BamaOnLine.com. But in terms of stress, where would you kind of put your meter right now where that's concerned?
Yeah, I think the reaction to anything in sports is just it comes down to what kind of personality somebody has. I mean, we had 3 weeks ago, write him a blank check to T Rod. We had an overreaction to assistant coaches leaving, and we saw through Saban's tenure. Nick Saban's the greatest coach of all time. I'm not sure it's really debatable at this stage. Yet every time he lost an assistant, it was a massive loss to some, right? And it never really, I mean, Kirby obviously was a great coach, but they still were super competitive after Kirby, obviously. So even Scott Cochran, guys that you would have never really thought to see away from him. So I don't think this is a huge surprise. I did find out that like a lot of people, like I'm still doing research on Grubb, and I know more about Kalen DeBoer than anybody else, and maybe Shepard. I know a lot about those guys because I've heard the most about them, but I was a little surprised that like the guys, like, they knew what a great Huff, Huff's a great offensive line coach. And I think that's because of the Joe Moore Award. And I don't doubt he's a good offensive line coach. I mean, he's got a job at the NFL. He had a job with Kalen DeBoer. I don't deny that Grubb's probably a fantastic play caller as well. But, when Kalen DeBoer was hired, everybody I talked to, every college coach talked about him as a play caller. They talked about him as an offensive guy, an offensive genius, the mastermind. They talked about Kalen DeBoer the most. It was very similar when you talk to people about Nick Saban's defense, right? They're like, it doesn't matter. It's Nick Saban's defense. It doesn't matter. It's Nick Saban's defense. That's what we always heard. I get that same vibe from Kalen. So I do feel confident that Kalen DeBoer is capable of calling his own plays. He's 49 years old. I mean, this isn't a guy that's past the thing. He's perfectly capable. And it's my understanding he's had the takeover if he doesn't like a play in a situation. I had one coach tell me he does a lot of the third and fourth down calls, even at Washington. So he's a heavily involved coach. I mean, the reaction is what it is. It's Friday night. We're 2 hours from the portal. Shit, in my mind, I've been counting it down for 29 days and 22 hours, not even lying. So when that hit, I wasn't very surprised. You know what I mean? I was like, of course you did it. And then you had the conspiracy theories and everything else. But all coaching moves are semantics. I was the Alabama offensive coordinator Wednesday, and Thursday I got another job. So you can talk your way out of it. We've seen it all at Alabama.
Yeah, you can, and especially in this climate for coaching, whether it's guys or staff trying to move from the G5 level up to the Power Fives, or from the Power Fives and the G5s to the National Football League. Jimmy, I guess I go back to what Tim said earlier, alluded to the anxiety that surrounded the defensive side of the ball, which in large part was because that's not where Kalen DeBoer's DNA stems from. But it seems like if you trusted him with those defensive hires, and he quelled a lot of concerns and a lot of anxiety, it seemed like anyway, initially, with the hires he made over there, you should kind of trust this guy in an area that is right in his wheelhouse.
I mean, this is exactly why you hired Kalen DeBoer in the first place, right? And what I harken back to is the day that it became apparent that DeBoer was going to be the guy. Within those few hours, before it became official and right after, there was no certainty whatsoever that Ryan Grubb was coming with him. I mean, there was a lot of thought at the time, well, Washington's probably just going to promote Ryan Grubb, right? Greg Byrne didn't make the hire based on, hey, Kalen, we want to hire you, and you're bringing Ryan and Scott, right? I mean, they're coming with you, right?
Contingent.
No.
Yeah.
He hired Kalen DeBoer to be the head coach. The staff falls where it falls. There was no plan that Grubb and Huff were a definitive part of this. And then it happened ultimately that they weren't. Hey, coaches are in demand. Who's to say that Grubb and Huff wouldn't have come this season and Alabama did really well on offense and they would have been hired away by the NFL next offseason? I mean, this is going to happen when you have really good assistant coaches. No one should know this more than Alabama fans.
Absolutely.
When you have really good assistant coaches, they're going to be poached by other elite programs and by the NFL. So this is just part of Kalen DeBoer's job is refilling his staff with quality, and he can either do it and he'll be successful, or he won't do it well and he won't be successful.
And
You know,
here's
you
the
go back
thing.
to Travis.
What?
You go back to remember when Brian Kelly left Notre Dame.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think half the staff came with him, right? And Jim Harbaugh took a job and 5 assistants.
Restayed at Notre Dame. Yeah.
Jimmy's absolutely right. And that's what I guess. That's what I'm saying. You don't hire, hey, we want to hire you and, you know, we like your wide receiver and offensive line coach. We want to hire those three. You hire the head coach and let him fill his role. And it's Jimmy's race, ultimately his butt on the line. You know, it doesn't matter. You like somebody or, you know, you saw him or knew him in high school or, you know, you want him to be more local. It doesn't matter. It's his job on the line. And the guy's been successful at every single stop. That's not fortunate. That's not luck. That means he knows what he's doing. You got to assume he knows what he's doing and putting his staff together here. And up until that point, and again, going back to Jimmy's point, we weren't even sure Grubb was going to come in to begin with. And hey, those attached to Grubb, this was going to be a never-ending process of an opening and him connected, because we were already Friday night hearing the UCLA connections. You know, we were already hearing he's up for the UCLA, and you think that's not a realistic possibility. They're now discussing Tommy Rees getting the UCLA head coaching job. So don't tell me Grubb's not at least on the table in that scenario. Grubb is almost like dating a girl way out of your league. You know, it's a matter of time she's dumping you, right? So you don't want to get too attached to it, because he's a fast riser, but you got to have faith that Kalen DeBoer knows how to run his own offense.
Yeah, he was just going to keep swiping on that app at some point.
Hey, and look, do you blame him? He's in Seattle.
No.
I looked it up. He's got a young daughter.
Saying this for 2 years. Yeah.
I mean, just even if the climate wasn't different, he's got a young daughter.
Yeah.
You know, when your kids are teenagers, they're all about the adventure. You can often talk them in to go into another city. When you're 6, 7, and 8, she's probably screaming. She doesn't want to leave her friends. She doesn't know there's other friends in the world. So there was a lot. He doesn't even have to move now. He doesn't have to re-get his cable turned on or nothing. He just gets to stay in the same house and go to work.
Well, we don't know. Maybe he's already cut the cord, but the point stands. And again, we're just underscoring the value of Ryan Grubb. We're not devaluing Ryan Grubb as a coach or Scott Huff by any means. If anything, as a Jacksonville Jaguar fans, guys, I'm jealous of the Seattle Seahawks that they're making these hires. I wish these guys were headed to Northeast Florida. Jimmy, let me ask you this. If you were to prioritize what Alabama needs to get done now on the offensive side of the ball in terms of staff, how would you rank offensive line, offensive coordinator? And I'm going to take quarterback and make it a standalone, because I think it's that important from a positional perspective. It's often tied in with coordinator, as we know. How would you view those as far as the importance of making those hires and understanding that Kalen DeBoer, as Tim talked about earlier, he doesn't have Sirius XM on those headphones during games. I mean, play calls are going through him. Situational football is running through Kalen DeBoer, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Is it obvious how you stack those up, or maybe do you look at them, in a little different order?
To me, it's a little obvious based on the Alabama circumstance. And by that, I mean, my answer to this question in general would always be, offensive coordinator, quarterback, always, but not in Alabama's case. And in this case, I think the biggest hire is the offensive line hire, because Kalen DeBoer can simply act as his own offensive coordinator and quarterback coach. Kalen DeBoer was an exceptional offensive coordinator when he did the job himself. It's his area of expertise. He could easily hire a young guy to serve as what amounts to an apprentice while he grooms a young guy to become the next Ryan Grubb. He could easily do that, but he can't coach the offensive line and coordinate the offense at the same time. So to me, the offensive line coach is a more critical thing at Alabama, just simply because Kalen DeBoer can't do that job too. But he can call plays. He can help coach the quarterbacks. Look at Sark at Texas. That's one of the best programs in the country right now. And Sark is the play caller. Quarterbacks like Arch Manning are signing with Texas, not to be coached by A.J. Milway, to be coached by Steve Sarkisian. So Kalen DeBoer could assume a Sark-type role and sort of run the offense like Sark does. So in that sense, to me, guys, the offensive line coach is a more critical hire, just simply because it's a little bit outside DeBoer's wheelhouse, and he's going to be dependent on the offensive line coach to know how to do that job and to get the job done.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Yep. Hey, Tim, in a scenario in which Kalen DeBoer is even more involved offensively, let's say during the actual season on a day-to-day basis, installation, game plan, maybe even play calling, is that something you would prefer, or would you rather Kalen DeBoer be more in that overseeing of the entire operation sort of role instead of, like Jimmy talked about, Sark? We saw it with Steve Spurrier in the 90s. What do you think? What do you prefer there?
I want him heavily involved in the offense. Again, this isn't an older coach. This isn't a 61-year-old coach who quit calling it. And, as you get older, you give those responsibilities up, like Kirby took them over for Alabama. But Nick Saban was still heavily involved. How do I know? Every game he was walking down that sideline to yell at Kirby, Pete, or Jeremy Pruitt, right? He was always in the discussions with that. Now, he was a lot older, but at 49 years old, you're just coming off being an offensive coordinator. So I'd love for him to be in there. And again, everybody, and this is volunteered information. When I talk about what a coach he was, the biggest question was obviously, can he recruit in the South, which we knew was the biggest question. And that's the biggest question, even if you're from the South. It doesn't, when Jeremy Pruitt got the job or when Glenn Schumann gets the job, that's going to be his question. Same for Dan Lanning. Whether you can recruit or not is whether or not you're going to have any chance to win. But they all talked about how great he was offensively. So I want him as involved as possible. I agree with Jimmy that the offensive line, probably the most important hire, because you can have, and this might come in-house. I mean, I know, I think the fans have not Sheridan. They don't really know anything about Sheridan. I mean, he coached in Indiana in a very awkward year. I've talked to coaches on the staff, not an ideal situation. But he's, again, if the guy is hired by the coach that you think is smart, you got to assume that guy brings something to the table. So it could be in-house, and I'm fully expecting to hear some of the old names that we hear in every coaching search, right? Freddie Kitchens. Are we going to get us a Rob Sales fighting? You know what I mean? We hear the same names in every search, even though they've never been hired. But Freddie Kitchens might make a little bit more sense now as far as an Alabama connection. He's calling the plays at North Carolina. But then again, he could be lined up to be the next coach in North Carolina for all we know when Mac retires.
Yeah, there's a lot to take into account. And
yeah.
Jimmy, let me ask you this. When you look at it as an either-or situation, would you rather have an offensive staff that has Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff and perhaps not the roster of players you have right now at Alabama, or the other way around? If you had to pick between the offensive roster for the Crimson Tide and maybe not having a couple of these offensive assistants that you thought you were getting with Kalen DeBoer, which scenario do you feel like you'd be in a better spot?
Well, I'm adamant. I've always been a talent over coaching. I mean, in terms of like what's most important are the players. And I'm not devaluing or minimizing the coaching. I'm not saying it's not important, and you can win with idiots running as long as you have, all 5-star talent. That's not true at all. But if I have to pick one or the other, I'm going to take a mediocre coach that's working with the 5-star as opposed to a great coach that's working with a mediocre player, because the mediocre player has a ceiling that's he's never going to rise above it no matter what his coaching is. Whereas the 5-star type super talent doesn't really matter who's coaching him. For instance, as we sit here, I'm sure you two can, or very possibly can. I don't know who Patrick Mahomes' coach is, the Kansas City Chiefs. I don't know, and I don't
Patrick
care.
Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes' coach.
Exactly.
It's the feeling I get.
I don't give Mike Trout's hitting coach any credit whatsoever. I give it all to Mike Trout. That's the way I feel about the players, even at the college level. Yes, and again, don't get it wrong that I'm saying coaching doesn't matter. It matters hugely. To win championships, you need great players and great coaches. But if I got to have one or the other, I'm choosing the players every single time. When I pick a horse to win the Kentucky Derby, I stupidly look at the horse. I don't give a lot of credence to the jockey. Maybe I should. But I'm gonna look at the horse.
Nick Saban said players over plays, right? Isn't that what Nick Saban himself always said? Now, SK here in the comments checking in, he says, or she says, coaching. We saw that talent experiment last year. I don't know, Tim. What did we see? We saw a team that ended Georgia's 29-game winning streak. We saw a team win the Southeastern Conference Championship. We saw a team lose in overtime to the eventual national champion. I mean, that's what we saw last year.
National champion that pretty much drummed everybody else, right? You know what I mean? Also coaching, we had Nick Saban, the greatest coach of all time. I think that was a good start, pretty good assistant jobs. I mean, again, Tommy Rees, say what you want, but now he's being mentioned for the head coaching job at UCLA, and Kevin Steele certainly did some things right. T-Rob was a highly sought after guy. So I think they had coaching last year, but I don't think the best coach in the world, you cannot take Nick Saban and send him to a 1A high school team and let him compete against better teams and win against them. It's still, you can't beat Nick Saban couldn't take a 1A team and beat Thompson. He'd have to recruit players in and get everybody else around him. But I do think it's a mixture.